I remember the first time I ever saw The Wizard of Oz. I was at my Uncle Struel's home and I was just very young. What struck me the most, aside from that house that crushes the witch, was the story of the scarecrow and the lion and the tin man. I remember thinking, how could he not have a brain? He seems to have a brain. And even more, what about the tin man's heart? I remember looking at his face and thinking, he looks a little tinny, but he does have emotions. And what does it mean not to have a heart? And how do you live without a heart? What happens to a human being if you lose your heart? And how do you regain your heart? And how you lose a heart is a story that may baffle a child, but that we can all guess at. The difficulties of life, self-involvement, when our egos overpower us, not finding other hearts that are willing to connect to ours, our sadnesses. Where are all the lonely people? Where do they all belong? All of the lonely people. And tragedy and loss. This is what closes down our heart. As the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai says in a poem talking about the Kotel and people and religious life and spiritual life, and he says, there are people who have hearts of stone, and there are stones who have hearts. And it is more interesting, perhaps, to think about how do we regain our hearts? How do we regain a heart and open a heart that is closed? One of the stories of Sukkot that I enjoy tells of the story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who every year would compete with all the other, with another Rebbe to find who could search out the best, the most beautiful etrog in all of Eastern Europe, in all the Ukraine and Poland. And every year his Hasidim would go through the land trying to find the best etrog. But there was one year when no one could find a single etrog. No etrog was to be found in the entire land. And the students of both Rebbes came back empty-handed to their Rebbes and said, there's nothing we can do this year. But then just as Rebbe Levi Yitzchak was about to despair of ever finding an etrog, one of his students quickly opened the door and said, I found one etrog, but it's only available for a huge sum. So without any delay or thought, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev grabs all the money that he has, all of his funds in pursuit of the etrog, and he travels to the faraway town where it had been found. But as he's traveling and on the way, he sees an old dilapidated looking wagon. And as he looks more closely, he sees that there's a man pulling it instead of a horse. And he stops his carriage and he asks him, where is your horse? And the man said, my horse got sick and died, and I cannot afford another one. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev says, well, how much does a new horse cost? And the man told him, and it was exactly the sum of money they brought with him. Without hesitation, he gave him all of his money and returned to his home. When the Hasidim of the other Rebbe heard what happened to Levi Yitzchak, they rejoiced, thinking surely this year they would win the contest. But their Rebbe silenced them and said, when we were competing for an etrog, I still had a chance of winning. But when Levi Yitzchak started to worship God with a horse, I had no chance. How do we regain our heart? We regain our heart by thinking about others first, by placing them before us. And to have an open heart is to feel others' pain and to feel their situation. Right? As a Tin Man, part of his journey in the Wizard of Oz is of discovering that. And even an open heart sometimes takes us to feel for another even beyond reason, beyond what makes sense. And I often think about that there is nothing more than shakes our heart when one of our children gets sick, especially when they're young. And you know they're fine, it's not a big fever, but somehow it just really moves your heart to pieces to see your child just even being a little bit sick. And Sukkot is a time when we try and regain our heart. It's one of the themes of the holiday. And the Midrash talks about the four species, the Arba Minim, as the four parts 4 different parts of our bodies. The lulav is our spine, the hadassim are our eyes, the myrtle our eyes, the aravot, the willow our lips, and the etrog is our heart. The etrog is our heart. And the etrog is the one that when it's supposed to take extra care to find the most beautiful etrog. And I've been to the markets in Jerusalem where there are people with magnifying glasses going through every etrog, trying to find the absolute perfect etrog because they're trying to find that most perfect heart. And then the Midrash continues and says, well, the 4 different species are comparable to 4 different kinds of Jews. The lulav, which tastes good, but does not smell good, is like a Jew who is learned in Torah but does not do good deeds. And the hadassim, the myrtle, which smells good but does not taste good, is as a Jew who does good deeds but does not try and expand their knowledge of Torah. And the aravot, the willow, which has neither good taste nor good smell, is like a Jew who does not seek out good deeds or try and expand their knowledge of Judaism. But the etrog smells good and tastes good, at least in jam. And this is the Jew who does good deeds and who also is learned in Torah. And we shake all 4 of them together because on Sukkot we're all together, no matter where we are, what place we have. But the tradition clearly is favoring the etrog and what it symbolizes. And we teach the living with an open heart opens us to both to wisdom and to doing good in the world. It teaches us about life. It prompts us to help others. There's a teaching in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, where Rabban Yochanan, who was one of the great early leaders of Judaism, who inspired his students to go out there and to create the religion that we now practice. And he said to his students one day, standing before him, go and observe which is the right way for a man to live. One of his students, Rabbi Eliezer, says, a good eye, right? How you see the world, that's what it means to live well. And then Rabbi Joshua says, to be a good companion. If you're a good companion to others, that shows something about your character. Rabbi Yossi says, a good neighbor. If you have a sense of civic responsibility and help others, that's what it means to be a good person. Rabbi Shimon says, foresight, the thoughtfulness to see ahead. And finally, Rabbi Elazar says, a good heart. And Rabbi Yochanan says, I prefer the words of Rabbi Elazar, a good heart, for in his words, all of your other words are included. And then Rabbi Yochanan continues and he says, well, go forth and observe what is an evil way for a person to avoid. Rabbi Eliezer comes back and says, an evil eye. When you see the world and see only evil, then that reflects. Rabbi Joshua says, an evil companion. If you are an evil companion to others, then that takes you in the wrong way. Rabbi Yossi says, an evil neighbor. Rabbi Shimon says, one who borrows and does not repay for what he borrows. That is a person who just lacks basic decency. And finally, Rabbi Elazar says, an evil heart. And Rabbi Yochanan says, I prefer the words of Rabbi Elazar, an evil heart. For in his words, all of your other words are included. And after the majesty of the holidays, the challenge of Sukkot, the gift of Sukkot is to open our hearts. Or as the prophets teach, circumcise our hearts. And what a great gift it is to be able to open our heart even just a little bit more, even just a little bit more, after we spent all the holidays beating them and wrenching them open, to find just a little bit more life flowing through them from within, from without. We do it by opening up to other people, by feeling what they are going through. And then we remember that our heart is not made of tin, but of living flesh. We had just forgotten. And this is what this whole period perhaps is about. We're all under the news, the COVID, everything that is happening. Learning how to open our hearts to the people in our lives, to all of humanity as we suffer through a difficult period together. And to see with dismay the state of division in this country and pray for unity and for a new beginning, to exchange our hearts of stone for hearts of flesh, to remember that our hearts can even bring life to stones. And all we must do is, as the tradition demands of us of the etrog, to try and look within to our heart and try and find the best possible face of it to show to the world, to use all of the energy that we can muster, to open up our heart just a little bit more this year, and to give it to all those who surround us. Chag Sameach.
Yasher Koach.
Chitzi